Before we get started, let me remind everyone you need to check and make sure that you're still subscribed to me on YouTube. There's a lot of people who think that they're subscribed, but they're really not. Just make sure for yourself. Also, if you're not following me on Twitter, you should. That's where a number of the professor's pearls of wisdom get dropped. Now, let's go ahead and get into the heart of this evening's video essay. There are some people who are going to be the habitually disagreeable or the people who just want to argue for argument's sake. So from the outset, let me say that the Persians, Iranians, whatever you want to call them, they are not our friends. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke put it, Africa's enemies came from Asia long before they started coming from Europe. I feel compelled to have to mention that because you always got a few people who are looking for attention who try that, and some of these people might wind up getting blocked if they keep it up. Now, we don't have a dog in this dust-up between the United States and Iran. It's an argument between a couple of thugs who are trying to figure out who's going to be the big dog in the Middle East. But that's not to say that the former slaves cannot learn anything simply from observing it. Indeed, there's a lot that can be gleaned by looking closely at what's happening between Iran and the United States. And also more to be learned when you take the long view. Why is this going on? Well, there's the white media's version of it, and then there's what actually happened. Of course, we have to go back a few years. Shortly after World War I, you had a situation where the Pahlavi family came to be the rulers of Iran. In 1925, the royal family of Qajar was deposed from power by the Persian, well, soon to be Iranian parliament. Now, why did this happen? Why did the Iranian parliament decide that the old king had to go? Well, it was because he failed to stop British and Soviet invasions on Persian sovereignty. See, if someone wants to call themselves being a leader, then they also must be able to maintain the state, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke explained. And if your leader fails to do that, then he should lose everything. After all, he wants to be the boss. He wants to be the one calling the shots. He wants to make these decisions that will impact the lives of untold millions and impact the lives of generations not born. And that being the case, he better be up to the task. He better not be there because he just was the idiot who managed to maneuver himself the best or he elbowed his way. He better be the most capable guy in the room. And he should know that before he goes calling himself seeking that brass ring. And in the event that he's not up to the job, then he is supposed to be punished harshly. Organizations who are serious about their power, they make sure that anybody who wants to be the boss understands the price of failure, and the price should be severe. Other groups practice this standard, and that's why their leaders take their positions seriously. Other groups expect their representatives to guarantee their economic and political benefits. This is the reason why when black people voice our concerns, these other people's representatives, they already know what their ethnic group expects them to do. As Dr. Anderson said, politicians react to the economy underneath them. And that even goes for people who are impoverished. Because if you don't have any material resources for the politician to respond to, then you better make sure that your poverty manifests itself in physical form. Politicians react to that too, especially when it's consistent. But anyway, Reza Pahlavi was the first Shah of Iran, but he didn't last long. In 1941, the Brits told him to let his son take over. And so the Shah and his family lived palatially, which would be fine if he was a private citizen, but this was supposed to be the leader of an entire nation and the man responsible for the state's economy. For him to live high on the hog, pal around with the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians, while the average Iranian citizen was destitute, that didn't go over well at all. Now, in time, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran, and he began reviewing Iran's petroleum dealings with the then Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later be renamed British Petroleum. Prime Minister Mossadegh looked and said, this situation is a complete and thorough ripoff. How the hell are we going to let the Brits have damn near 60% ownership stake in our oil? How the hell are we going to let them tell us what to do? And so he told the Brits The deal was off. He nationalized the Iranian oil industry, effectively taking it back from the British. Now, Britain then, as now, was highly dependent on Iranian oil to pay their bills. And as far as the United States goes, the US needs oil in order to prop up the dollar. Ever since Aramco, the US forced the world to trade for oil in dollars. That's where the term petrodollars comes from. What that means is if the US declares that it's not going to let you have any dollars, then you have no way to buy or sell oil. That's what it effectively means. Now, the British, having been shut out of the Iranian oil fields, they decided they would get the US to begin agitating for the removal of Prime Minister Mossadegh by bribing and otherwise incentivizing Mossadegh's fellow Iranians like the Shah and some of the people who were out in the boondocks, a lot of the people, those rural yokels. The U.S. started trying to get them to agitate for Mossadegh to be removed. All you need is some street protests and a few people to say, oh, he's so mean, and you can run, you're off to the races. And it's all meant to set the stage to get him forced out of office. It didn't matter how many people wanted him in there. It's just a matter we got to manufacture the right headlines, manufacture the right photographs, manufacture the right newsreels. Problem was, Mossadegh was overwhelmingly loved by the people of Iran to the point where even the Shah was scared to try to remove him. As far as he was concerned, I get rid of Mossadegh, the people are going to get rid of me. So the British and the CIA settled on a strategy of constructing a narrative meant to make the coup more politically acceptable. The chosen lie that they settled on would be that Mossadegh was a socialist, and that this socialist would hand Iran's oil over to the Soviets any moment. At least that's what they were saying. Now, of course, that's ridiculous on its face. There is no instance in the entirety of human history of any leader of a nation nationalizing his country's resources and then handing it over to somebody else. It defeats the whole purpose of what you're doing. The entire reason that you would nationalize the oil fields to get them out of the hands of the British is because you did not want them in the hands of another country. But the thing is, this is the kind of tortured logic, such as it is, and the kind of psychological pretzels that the British and the Americans were willing to put out there. And there's always a few rubes who basically stop listening to anything you say once you say certain trigger words. We know that people on the reactionary right, as soon as you say the word socialist, that's it. They've completely tuned out everything you've said after that, and they're basically a puppet at that point. So, how did the CIA begin to carry out its little propaganda offensive against Prime Minister Mossadegh? What it did was it had a series of false flag operations. They would hire a bunch of Iranian locals who would pretend to be supporters of Mossadegh and his policies. But these people were actually paid CIA agents. I think that bears repeating because I want to make sure that you understand that. What the CIA did was they paid certain Iranians to go out in the streets and cause trouble and make a ruckus, and these Iranians would be pretending to be supporters of Mossadegh, pretending to support his policies, but making sure whenever they got in front of news cameras, who were also people put in place by the US and British governments, be sure to say, we are here because we believe in these socialist policies. Mossadegh has a socialist future, and we're here to make sure that the socialist future comes to pass. And that's what they did. They paid people to pretend as if they were supporting Prime Minister Mossadegh when they were actually CIA plants. Now, gee, doesn't that sound like something we've had occur with us recently? You know, government operatives, former prosecutors, former congressional staffers who are now trying to reinvent themselves as black power activists, but who are actually in the pockets of white power. Gee, I wonder. Anyway, back then in the 1950s in Iran, these CIA paid agitators began making problems in the streets. And at that point, Mossadegh, who began to read the tea leaves and he could clearly see what it was that the US and the Brits were trying to cook up, he called for a referendum of the people to vote to dissolve the Iranian parliament and to give him, Mossadegh, unilateral power until the crisis was over. He essentially was calling for effectively to have one man rule. And the measure passed by 99%. 99% of Iranians who voted on that referendum said, yeah, we're in favor of it. They could see what was happening too. And so the U.S., realizing that it had to strike fast, told the Shah to go ahead and dismiss Mossadegh as prime minister. They made it clear to the Shah, you don't get this Mossadegh guy out of here. We're prepared to move without you. Which, of course, was letting him know, hey, if we got to move without you, then what the hell do we need you for? So the Shah, he went ahead and said, you know what? I'm calling for Prime Minister Mossadegh's resignation. In fact, I'm not even sure if the Shah was in Iran at the time. I think he did it while he was overseas. And even though the Shah's decree did not undercut Mossadegh's support, what it did do was it gave the CIA exactly the headlines that it wanted. It gave them exactly the political justification that they were looking for, at least on the surface. Why? The king, the ruler of Iran, has an out-of-control prime minister, and well, he can't handle this guy himself, so we, being the good freedom-loving, peace-loving people that we are in the U.S., why, look at the Negroes if you need any more proof of how peace-loving we are. We're going to go ahead and help the Shah out because clearly he's in over his head and this Mossadegh guy is out of control. Why, look at these socialists in the streets. Where the hell they come from? And that's when the U.S. said, all right then, time to get Mossadegh out of here. We'll do it ourselves. And that's when you had the real insurrection began. Street riots, orchestrated and paid for by the CIA, took place. And in order to control the anti-democratic forces of Mossadegh, the Shah had no choice but to call out the military. But the military didn't spend much time dealing with those protesters in the streets, because after all, the CIA had given them their paycheck and it's time for them to go home. But who the Iranian military did immediately go after was the Prime Minister's office. The military arrested Mossadegh. They tried him. They put him in prison briefly, which was followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. Now, that's a political prisoner 101, but that's what happened to the prime minister of Iran who decided that he wasn't going to give away his people's vital national resources. Next, the U.S. had Shah Pahlavi install a U.S.-selected puppet to be the new prime minister, and this one, of course, was a rubber stamp for the U.S. This new guy just restored all the old bad agreements and the scam, the robbing of Iran's oil for the sake of white petrochemical corporations and the U.S. and British government's own personal benefit went on as always. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, figured that his white supremacist pals made the will of the Iranian people irrelevant, so he could push forward with the plans that his good white paymasters were telling him to do to transform the whole of Iranian society into one that would be much more submissive to Western power. And what that meant was the Shah was supposed to preside over the dismantling of Iran's culture. You see, culture means the particular way that a group does things. That's what the word culture means. It's a manifestation of a group's identity. And when you strip a people of their culture, after that you can graft onto them any identity you want. And you can tell them this is normal for you because you've robbed them of the knowledge of what actually is normal for them. This is what the U.S. wanted the Shah to do, and this is what he tried to carry out. The Iranian people fully recognized that the Shah was merely a U.S.-British puppet, and this became most excruciatingly clear in 1963 when the Shah began pushing a number of Western reforms onto Iran, which the Shah called his White Revolution. I'm not making that up. That's what he called it. The White Revolution. Well, talk about truth in advertising. It was white, all right. Definitely who was behind it and who it was meant to benefit. And it's one of the U.S. government's own websites that admits that the United States has a high interest in Iran, not just because of its oil, but because of its location in the region, which is just south of the then Soviet Union, which then as now is a rival to the United States. There's a lot of benefits that the United States could reap if it could get, or rather reinstall, a government that would do what Washington wants. Iran is centrally placed for that purpose. Now, as you would expect, the white media gives a hideously edited version of what the white revolution was. The white media makes it seem like, well, all it was about was voting rights for women. That's the white revolution. It was voting rights for women, and that's the line that they usually push. Well, the problem was the white revolution changed a hell of a lot more than just that. Part of the white revolution involved the Iranian parliament granting all U.S. military personnel in their country full diplomatic immunity, meaning that the law could not touch any U.S. soldier no matter what they did. I want you to think about that. Legal immunity, not just for diplomats, which you would expect, that's who it's supposed to apply to, but also for the soldiers who the U.S. put in Iran as well. This is what white power insisted on, that the same way white people are immune from the law in the United States, they demanded that the Iranians give white people the same legal immunity there as well. So a bunch of podunk hillbillies with their Confederate flags would have a license to rape and kill women in Iran. That's what it would amount to. And the worst that would happen to them is that they would be expelled from the country. But that's it. As we've seen so often in the U.S., good old boys and other assorted deplorables gleefully carry out all manner of beatings and rapes of black women, even murders, and they routinely engage in this behavior in the foreign countries that they're stationed in the military, and under the Shah, there was nothing that the host country could do about it. That was the plan anyway. So this was effectively to make white Americans in Iran into super citizens, not just a handful of exceptions, but there would be an entire group running around Iranian society who the law could not touch. In return, the United States gave Iran $200 million for military equipment. When the people of Iran saw this, and especially the Iranian clergy, they looked and said, well, it's pretty obvious what the going price for Shah Reza Pahlavi's soul is, $200 million, and there you go. And speaking of Iranian clergy, since religion has always been the key to that region, the Shah decided that he would target Iran's clerics as well. The White Revolution involved a heavy campaign to diminish the power of the Iranian clerics, who had been the cultural gatekeepers. They had been the ones who the Shah looked at as being the only real competition to his rule, because disputes and everyday matters were not handled by the Shah or by the Iranian government. They were largely handled according to tradition. And that tradition was maintained and carried out by the clerics. They were the ones who were the enforcers of Iranian culture. And it was not left up to the politicians or self-appointed kings to do whatever they found to be the most personally expedient. The clerics wanted to maintain the inherently Islamic character of Iran. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the other hand, wanted to get rid of that, and to get rid of anyone who refused to do things the white way. The Iranian people, realizing they had been betrayed, began looking around to find other voices to look to for guidance. The people were determined to maintain their Islamic identity, and even if you called yourself the king, the Iranian people would turn their backs on you if you were off code. See, the Iranian people understood what being on code means. That comes from the grassroots. It doesn't come from any leader. That's the reason why looking to a man to be the leader is a bad idea. The Iranian people did not put their faith and future in the hands of a man. They put it in the hands of their code. And back in the 1960s, they were on code as they are today. The code is their leader. Any so-called representative, the only thing he is merely an agreed-upon facilitator of the code. I was on Twitter about that earlier today. That when you have a leader, that's not supposed to be somebody who you are following around slavishly, you don't question anything. No, he is your servant. The code is the leader. That's the only logical purpose that voting serves, or trying to find some person to put into a particular office of government. The only logic, the only purpose that could serve is for that person to facilitate the code. And it is the people's job to be code enforcement. Because what happens when the facilitator turns against the people? Then the people find a new facilitator, and you make sure to punish the old one. That's part of the code too. The guy can't just be allowed to saunter out the door as if, oh well, I guess I'm done. It's like, no, we're gonna put a couple of knots on your head, and you better pray that's where it stops. That's code enforcement. In 1963, the Shah thought that he was the leader. Well, the Iranian people were about to show the Shah exactly who was in charge, and it wasn't him. Enter a then well-known cleric named Sayyid Ruhollah Musavi Khomeini, who went by the Islamic honorific Ayatollah Khomeini. The Ayatollah Khomeini began to produce sermons pointing out the corruption of the Shah's regime, specifically how the Shah lived in opulence and totally ignored the needs of the people who lived in poverty. The Shah was more interested in protecting the oil interest of his white backers than withstanding his nation on its feet. But the Ayatollah Khomeini also made it a point to rail against what he called the Shah's dependence on Israel. After all, it was the Israelis who the Shah called on to train his state security force, the Savak. Khomeini was himself a staunch supporter of the Palestinians, and Khomeini repeatedly voiced his opposition to the existence of Palestine having been displaced by Israel. That a world leader who stridently advocated for Palestine in his speeches also sat on top of so much oil, that was a threat for Israel and the U.S. The U.S. was trying to reshape the political profile of the Middle East, and that means having only Islamic leaders who are not opposed to the occupation of Palestine, or who at most are lukewarm on the issue. This way, the Arab public and the world would accept the displacement of the Palestinians because, after all, you don't see the leaders of these Middle Eastern countries getting worked up over it, so it must not be that big a deal. But the Arab street cares about Palestine and what it represents. And having someone who reminds the Arab street that an Islamic leader is supposed to be standing with Palestine and that the situation of the Palestinians is intolerable, this was a growing threat. It was clear that in the Ayatollah Khomeini, regardless of his flaws, the U.S. was being confronted with a man who could not be bribed, a man who could not be threatened, and a man who could not be persuaded otherwise. He was a true believer, and exactly the wrong kind of example to be setting for the Arab world. White power wanted the Arab people to expect their leaders to be corrupt, to expect them to be equivocal and non-committal on the issue of Israel or the Palestinians, to expect their leaders to put white nations' interests before their own. All the regime change in the Middle East, all that regime change has basically been a large-scale project to condition and maintain the people of the Middle East ideal to expect their leaders to be corrupt and to accept that status quo. Khomeini, however, continually railed against the Shah's so-called reforms, and he even warned the Shah that he could well find himself compelled to leave Iran if he continued on this course. The Iranian people loved it. This was a man who stood up for their culture, a man who said the things that they said, a man who put their interests first, a man who spoke up unapologetically and fearlessly for them. The people were angry. Ayatollah Khomeini simply gave voice to that anger, the anger that already existed. The Shah refused to stop his so-called reforms, and Khomeini continued to criticize them. Eventually, the anger that Khomeini had warned about erupted in the streets. The Shah blamed the Ayatollah Khomeini personally for this, and he had the man imprisoned. The Ayatollah was then forced into exile in Turkey, then Iraq, and finally in France. But the Ayatollah Khomeini never stopped his sermons attacking the Shah's regime, and he never stopped planning what a post-Shah Iran was going to look like. Ayatollah Khomeini was shut out of all broad-based forms of media. He had no actual media platform of his own, so he decided to create one. What he did was he would have his sermons tape recorded, and then his supporters would smuggle these recordings into Iran where they would be played for the people. In exile, the Ayatollah's influence had grown larger than it was when he had been in the country. See, the real fuel for the Ayatollah Khomeini's power wasn't his sermons. It was the continued corruption of Shah Reza Pahlavi. Now, if the Shah had stopped dismantling the Islamic identity of Iran, stopped being a Western stooge, then no one would have listened to the Ayatollah because there would have been no reason to. But, as it was, Khomeini kept preaching his truth, and the people kept listening, and that listenership grew and grew year by year, as did the anger in the Arab street. And there was nothing the Shah could do about it now. Because of his actions, he had placed the Ayatollah Khomeini far beyond his reach. See, the Iranians understood that a people who do not stand up for their advocates will have no advocates. Whenever you have an oppressed group, there will always be those who speak up for the people. But the thing is, these are individuals who the dominant society will take aim at for the sake of destroying them. Go ahead and discredit or find a way to reduce them in power if you can. Kill them if you must. Not because of the fact that these spokespeople have power, but because of the fact that their message is a threat, that you're creating a culture of defiance. And that is the one thing that any oppressor class is going to be determined to keep those they oppress from having. A culture of defiance, true defiance, not a little bit of grumbling, not a culture of murmuring, or of impotent complaining on the sidelines, but when you're looking and going, God dang it, we're going to change this situation. Now, you can't have people getting a daily diet of defiance. You cannot have that. But that's exactly what Ayatollah Khomeini was feeding the Iranian people. And they were listening, and they were embracing his message, and they were supporting him as a result. Ayatollah Khomeini was a true elder for the people in Iran. He wasn't some irrelevant old man running around telling them you should respect me because I got gray hair. He was telling them this is the way we're going to get our country back. Khomeini earned his people's respect, and that's the reason why, unlike the Shah, he never had to demand it. He never had to demand his people's respect. He commanded it because of who he was and the ideals that he espoused, what he represented. And so, by the late 1970s, the people of Iran rose up again at the behest of Ayatollah Khomeini. Only this time, there would be no way to stop it. You see, Ayatollah Khomeini understood the necessity of being able to strike at his enemies from the shadows. That's why I keep using that old U.S. Navy submariners saying, run silent, run deep. Because of the fact that he was not determined to have some big tent, some big gathering that the Shah could see. What he was doing was he was taking his message to the people and not doing it in a way that would allow the Shah to be able to strike at him. When you're in a fight against evil, you're not supposed to be looking for a level playing field. You're supposed to make sure that playing field is as lopsided in your favor as possible. When you're dealing with an evil like this, you don't try to figure out how to have a fair fight. Forget about fair. I value fair competition with honorable people, but when it comes to the dishonorable and the disgusting and the corrupt, forget it. There are no rules other than the good guys must win. That's the only rule. Khomeini knew where his opponent was at. Khomeini knew and was letting everybody know this is the guy that we're going to be taking down. The Shah, on the other hand, had no such advantage. That's what you got to do when you're an oppressed group. You got to make sure that you create every advantage for yourself against your enemy that you possibly can. And so, on January 16th, 1979, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who had been in power since the 1940s, was forced to flee Iran, as the Ayatollah Khomeini had prophesied. 2 weeks after that, Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile, only this time it was not as a mere cleric, but now as the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the new ruler of a new Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini began his reign by cleaning house. Anyone who had worked for or been loyal to the Shah was purged. That meant that they were executed. He was not going to allow any pro-Western fifth column to take root in his Iran. You see, the Ayatollah Khomeini had learned the lesson of what happened to Mohammad Mossadegh. He knew what kind of games the U.S. would try to play, and he cut it off before it even began. Now, you see, that's what happens when you got somebody who's serious about their power. The Haitian Revolution had the same thing happen, except they did that before they started agitating against the French. The biggest problem that any group of oppressed people have throwing off their chains are going to be the enemy within. This is a historical fact. This is a historical constant. Show me a group of oppressed people, and I'll show you a group of people who are riddled and run through with a whole bunch of turncoats, bootlicks, traitors, suck-ups, snitches, and informants. And if that group wants to be free, at some point they're going to have to confront the enemy within. They're going to have to get serious about the idea that, no, we ain't going to have all these snitches and all of these turncoats running around. That's off code, and there will be a price to pay for being off code. The Ayatollah Khomeini understood that lesson, and that's why the U.S. wasn't able to gin up some quickie revolution against them. There wasn't going to be any people in the streets saying that, oh, we just can't stand this Iran, we can't stand this Ayatollah, oh, he's this, he's that. Nah, you're not going to be sitting here putting together any phony baloney false flag operations for the cameras. And just to make sure that the Islamic identity of Iran reasserted itself forcefully, the Ayatollah Khomeini dismantled the Shah's reforms and he outlawed everything, including even Western music. That's how far he went with it. What he was doing was he was humiliating the former Shah. This was the humiliation of Reza Pahlavi. Because Reza Pahlavi's entire life, such as it was, had been dedicated to making Iran into nothing more than a whorehouse for the West, to completely strip it of its Islamic identity and to graft onto Iran a European identity. But the identity would not be anything other than imitation European serfs. They would just be a bunch of European peasants. That's the identity that Reza Pahlavi was attempting to graft onto Iran. And Pahlavi was just so sure that his white revolution had been successful. He was so sure that the people had accepted it, that it had taken with the people. He was so sure of that he had completely changed Iran. But Ayatollah Khomeini proved him wrong. And just to make sure the Americans got the point, the Ayatollah also presided over the taking of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, with the U.S. Embassy staff being taken as hostages. Now, eventually, the Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, and yet the revolution that he set in motion over a quarter century earlier, the revolution didn't start in 79. The revolution started in 63. And that revolution has now far outlived the Ayatollah Khomeini. See, the white folks in the West, they figured that the Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was the leader of the revolution, but he understood that the ideology was the leader. See, if it was only just him as a leader, then what happens is he becomes irrelevant when you put him into exile. That's what happens if you have a leader who makes a movement into nothing more than a cult of personality. You have a particularly charismatic individual who really hasn't built anything that's going to survive beyond him or that can survive without him. So all you got to do is you got to kill the guy or you put him in prison, problem solved. That didn't work with the Ayatollah Khomeini because the Ayatollah Khomeini was not the leader of the revolution. The ideology was the leader. The people listened to him because of the fact that he was the only one with the guts to stand up for the code. The people were waiting for somebody who would do so. The other clerics were kind of twiddling their thumbs and didn't want to step on any toes. And after all, as Dr. John Henrik Clarke beautifully pointed out, you go all throughout the Arab world, including in Iran, and you will find these allegedly so-called self-proclaimed devout Muslims who will be, as Dr. Clarke put it, drinking scotch, eating pork, and patronizing European whores. These guys do not really believe in anything. They'll go ahead and do that pious routine for the people, but as soon as these guys are away from the people, they're acting no better than their European counterparts, and that tells you everything you need to know about them. But the Ayatollah Khomeini wasn't like that. He believed what it was that he was saying. And that's what made him so dangerous to the Western powers, but that was also what made him so beloved by the Iranian people. He stood for their code. His defiance humiliated the US and Britain. White supremacy doesn't believe in taking any L's. And they also believe in total control. So when a man who white power did not sanction begins riling up the people and white power can't control him or stop him, that's a problem. And that brings us to where we are today. Between the United States and Israel, they're looking at Iran and going, this revolution that got set off, they're still embracing it. We have to break the collective will of the Iranian people. But what that's going to require, you're going to need to bring in a stooge, somebody who's going to be nothing more than a puppet, but a very brutal, very repressive puppet. And that's what's been going on, the experiment that the US and Israel together have been hoping to pull off, that they can, if you have this center of power sitting on top of a lot of potential economic resources, and they're influential in the region because they actually stand on their religious principles, and there's a lot of people who believe the same thing in the region. So how are you going to get people off of that? Well, you got to get somebody in a position of authority there. Get somebody who's going to call himself the leader because you installed him. And he's going to say, you know what? New deal, new rules. All that old stuff is out the window, and why we're going to be doing very differently. Well, what are you going to be doing? We're going to be doing whatever these white folks tell us to do. That's the goal. And by doing so, well, you're going to have one of the few holdouts against Western influence in the region that will be gone. And if the guys who have stood against it and held out the longest crumble, well, that would, as it's believed to be anyway, that would be such a psychological blow. Because keep in mind, when people start saying this garbage about Iran's the world's largest sponsor of state terror, no, the biggest sponsor of state terror in the world is the United States. The United States carries out more terrorism inside its own borders than practically all the other so-called state sponsors of terrorism combined. How many people have died at the hands of the enforcement arm of white supremacy inside the United States? Now, how many people have died at the hands of terrorists globally in the last year? You go ahead and do an apples-to-apples comparison. It's like night and day. You can't compare the two. So this is what is going on whenever you hear them talking about state sponsor of terrorism. You're going to need to have a lie to hang your hat on. And regardless of what you may think of Iran personally, there is nothing you can say about Iran that you cannot say about the United States. Today, on my Twitter page, I was pointing out that this garbage about Law Enforcement Appreciation Day, can you believe that somebody had the nerve to actually pull that on Twitter? Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. Well, I went ahead and had some choice words about how much we appreciate the thugs in blue. But you had some idiot who, when I posted that the U.S. has more people behind bars than any other country on the planet, that the U.S. is the most incarcerative state on the planet, has more people behind bars than North Korea, more people behind bars than Iran, more people behind bars than China. China has 6 times the population of the U.S., but the U.S. has more people behind bars. Now, who's the police state here? The United States has pretty much the only actual professional school for terrorists, the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. All of those Latin American regimes responsible for God knows what kind of ghastly crimes. Where do you think that those guys get their training from? The U.S. provided it for them. And again, we have no dog in this fight, but the point that I'm making that I'm sure you guys are well aware of, before you go listening to anyone trying to tell you how bad some other country is, you need to consider the source. Whatever acts of terror you want to accuse Iran of, fine. I'm not here to stand up for them. I'm not here to defend them. Just keep in mind that the main people who are pointing the dirty end of the stick at Iran, these are governments and people who have done far, far worse. The body count's much worse by the U.S. than anything Iran could have done. Think about that while they're trying to tell you we have to go to war because human life is so precious. I was posting on my Twitter page today that you had 176 people or so who died as a result of that Ukrainian airliner that went down, which was allegedly shot down by the Iranians. And you got the white media and the government saying there should be war now. Well, why? Because so many lives were lost. When this many lives are lost, war! Someone must be punished. Well, twice that many people died in those 737 MAX crashes. Boeing is responsible for killing more people in the last 18 months than the Iranians, twice as many. And by the way, unlike with that Ukrainian airliner, 9 of the people who died in those 737 MAX crashes were Americans. And yet the white media is not saying something has to be done about Boeing. When are they going to get punished? They're not beating the drum for Boeing executives to get put on trial and put in handcuffs. Quite the opposite. What's been happening is Boeing has been allowed to quietly settle these legal claims out of court. Keep in mind, Boeing gets huge tax breaks, which basically amount to subsidies. And those subsidies are financed by U.S. taxpayers. That's how these big corporations get these tax breaks. It's balanced on the backs of the working poor. So Boeing kills over 340 people. And they get to go to court, not to prison. They go to civil court so they can negotiate what the payout's going to be, and they're paying off their victims with your and my money. Whatever happened to we got to do something because so many lives were lost? Yeah, if it's a bunch of Arabs or Iranians who you want to blame, then something has to be done. But what if it's some white corporate executives? What if it's some white guys in the United States? So you need to have both eyes open when it comes to this. Understand what's really at the root of the United States and Israel's perpetual obsession with Iran. Again, Iran is no friend of ours. Iran has done nothing on our behalf, and I'm not speaking up for Iran. I'm just pointing out that they hate Iran because it's been a bastion of defiance. Same reason why they've had this mad on for all these years about Robert Mugabe. If they look and say, we got to get you out of there, they'll try the old coup. They'll try the old, we'll bribe some internal elements who we know don't like you because everybody's got enemies. So we'll find some of your enemies. We're going to give them money and backing. We're going to help them throw you out. And we'll be able to say, hey, it wasn't us. It was why the people didn't like his own people didn't like him. And if you do manage to defy the coup, then what we'll say is, well, the people don't like him because if they did, why did they try to overthrow him? Oh, you mean these paid stooges? Well, they tried to overthrow him, so he can't be too popular. Why someone tried to overthrow him? Notice how nobody ever says that the presidents of the United States who have been shot, killed, what have you, attempts on their lives, well, that proves the American people don't like you, so America needs regime change. You see, that street only goes one way. So while President Trump's sudden bout of infatuation with Iran is ultimately going to prove to be short-lived, there are some things that we should know about it. The fact that this is even happening at all says a lot. Iran is on the United States to-do list, not merely because of support for Israel, but also because of a historical bad example that the U.S. feels Iran has set. And it's going to be a matter of, now we can't deal with this like they dealt with Cuba. This is different. This one is different. What's going to have to happen here is they're going to need to show the Iranian people, look at these mullahs, look at these true believers here. You're going to have to go in another direction because we're going to break these guys. And by breaking them, that's going to prove to you that your way doesn't work. Otherwise, your own would-be true believers have bent the knee. That's what the U.S. ultimately wants. Crush these guys to dust, force them to bend the knee, and this is going to break the will of the Iranian people to resist. Will they be successful? Well, if history is any guide, the answer is an unqualified no. Not because of any particular leader. The Ayatollah Khomeini's been dead for over 30 years now. And yet, for some strange reason, Iran has remained on course. One gets the idea that it's not Ayatollah Khomeini who was the driving force behind it. This is something at the grassroots. So how are you going to break the culture of an entire people? Well, you got to get them off code. And whether or not the attempts to get the Iranians off code is going to come down to the Iranian people themselves. Because in 1963, Shah Reza Pahlavi thought that he had defeated the Ayatollah Khomeini. He had the guy arrested and had him forced out of the country. I'm sure that there were more than a few days that the Shah looked and said, "Yeah, that guy, he said that the people were going to run me out. Look at him. Yeah. Hey, how you like things in Turkey? Oh, you're not in Turkey anymore. You're in Iraq. Oh, you're not in Iraq anymore. You're in France. Yeah, kind of hard to find a place to hang your hat these days now, isn't it?" I'm sure that the Shah had a few chuckles at the Ayatollah Khomeini's expense. But what he found out was when you got a man who is speaking on behalf of a people who are on code, well, he's the one who gets the last laugh.